All right, let's get started, everybody. Got a few coming in yet. All right. Welcome. Well, let's open in a word of prayer, and then we're going to dive into chapters 14, 15, and 16 tonight. All right? Lord Jesus, we just thank you for this time to be together to open your word. Lord, I just pray that our hearts would be open to hear what the Spirit is saying to us tonight as we walk through these chapters. Lord, encourage our hearts by what we read tonight, and also motivate us tonight by what we read and what we see tonight. And I ask it in your name. Amen. All right. Well, if you weren't here last week, let me just give you a little bit of a recap. So last week we talked about some key characters in this cosmic battle that we find ourselves in, all right? We were talking about, again, it was perfect timing off a Crystal sermon on spiritual warfare, because last week we were talking about this cosmic battle, and we were talking about these key players. And so we started off talking about the woman, all right? Remember that? And just by way of review, who does the woman represent? Israel. Mary. Who else? And the church and us. Right. So the woman is all-inclusive, represents all of those things, okay? And remember that we talked next about the dragon, and the dragon is out to kill the seed of the woman, right? So all of those things. So since the beginning, the dragon has been after God's people, Israel. He was after Mary because she was going to give birth to Jesus, our Messiah. He was after the church, and he's after you, okay? So that's the concept of the woman. Then we talked about the dragon and how the dragon is Satan. And one of the things we mentioned in chapter 12 is that it tells us 6 different times that the dragon has been thrown down or defeated. So even in the midst of God, kind of introducing us to all these characters, as soon as that character is introduced and we find out that that character has been after God's children since time immemorial, the next thing we're told is, but he was thrown down. And it's emphasized 6 different times. So if God says something once, okay, if he says it twice, it's really important. He says it any more than that, you better really be paying attention. So that's one of those, pay attention to this. No matter what you read in the coming chapters, remember, he has been thrown down, all right? And then we talked about the fact that in Hebrew, there's this little kind of joke. The word used there for Hebrew means he got bounced. He got bounced out of there, okay? And then we talked about the 2 beasts, one that rises out of the sea, the other comes from the earth. So the beast that rises out of the sea was tied to what? Whose vision in the Old Testament? Daniel's vision. His vision of the statue, okay? And the statue represented the great empires of the world that have come and now gone. And then we talked about the interpretation for us today is the nation states that have come out. So the beasts that rise out of the sea are the nation states that have come out from under the rule and reign of God with their ungodly philosophies and ambitions, right? And we talked about how these philosophies are demonically inspired. Therefore, they are very resilient, right? It's hard to kill them. Why? Because they are demonic. It's like anti-Semitism is a demonically inspired philosophy that just keeps circling from generation to generation, and we have times where it's really, really bad, and then it seems to go away for a little bit, and then it comes roaring back again. Why? Because it's hard to kill that thing, because it's demonically inspired. It's demonically influenced, right? And so you see that. I talked about how 2 of the beasts that rises out of the sea, he has 7 horns. 2 of them are cut off, and then we're told they grow back again. And so that represents these philosophies get cut off for a while, but then they keep coming back again. So in our day, when we talk about political philosophies, you have philosophies like socialism, communism, Marxism. We know that none of them work. None of them have ever worked. And yet you have a whole group of young, fresh minds that are all into socialism in our nation. because they think it's going to work, because it only works on paper. And even then, it's questionable. But it has never worked in any society, any nation. It makes a mess of things, right? Go live in Eastern Europe. Tell me how much they love communism, Marxism, and socialism. They'll laugh right in your face, right? It's been a disaster for them. Why don't those things die? Because all of those philosophies, those political philosophies, the beast that rises out of the sea manipulates politics and philosophies, and you just can't kill these things. Even when they don't work, people keep going back to them. How many times do they have to fail, right? Name for me one successful nation that has embraced those philosophies, where the people are happy and living a great life and all that kind of stuff. Doesn't happen. And then we talked about the second beast, which is the beast that rises out of the earth. And that is the false prophet, whose job is to make everyone worship who? The first beast. And so the job of the false prophet is to coerce and deceive people into supporting the beast. And in particular, to deceive religious institutions. So what the false prophet does is he manipulates and influences the religious world, telling people that they need to put their hope in the state, in the government, instead of Jesus, right? And we gave you some examples about that. We gave you examples of that were in the past, in the days when John was writing this, right? The false beast was encouraging, all right, the people, the religious people, to bow down to Domitian, and many of them did, right? And then more recently, we talked about World War II, right? And how the churches were coerced, right? Through propaganda. They were coerced to support Hitler. And that's what gave rise to people like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who stood up and said, we will not be silent. This guy is evil. But you had the state church of Germany, which was Lutheran, that was completely duped, completely deceived. And they supported Hitler because they were told, man, he's the guy that's going to bring Germany out of the funk that we've been in since World War II, right? And then more recently, if we think, well, how could the Germans be so dumb to do that? The German churches, you have all the churches that when COVID hit, they just did whatever the government told them to do. Without question, right? I'm not saying right or wrong. I'm saying that spirit is alive, right? And then finally, probably the most interesting conversation we had last week was, what is the mark of the beast? And so if you weren't here last week, I would encourage you to go back to our YouTube channel and you can watch the entire thing where I explain in depth what the mark of the beast is. But just the real short of it is, to just wet your whistle if you weren't here, I explained how that when you look at the text, the interpretation of what the mark of the beast is, in a nutshell, it's giving your heart or your allegiance to any leader or philosophy other than Jesus, right? And I explained how we got that interpretation from going back to the Jewish practice, because when it says they received the mark on their forehead and on their hand, all of John's readers in that day immediately would have thought of the Shema in Deuteronomy. The Lord our God is one God. All the Jewish men would have been thinking about what they do every day. Every morning when a Jewish man wakes up, he says the Shema, but as he's doing it, he has a box called the Tefillah, which contains the law, a little Torah scroll. And it gets attached to his head. And then the whole idea is, I am devoted to God, the Word of God. I'm devoted to the Word of God. And then it's seen through my hand, my actions. And then they have things that they put on their hand as well. So it's a forehead and a hand thing. And it's all about allegiance. Is my allegiance to the Word of God, or is my... So they understood the whole concept of the mark of the beast. Oh, the forehead, the hand. Giving my allegiance, giving my heart to a philosophy that is in opposition to God. All right? So we talked about all that last week, but if you want kind of the fuller explanation of that, it'll be in the tape from last week. All right? And last week was all about really making you aware of this cosmic battle. The one thing I didn't talk about last week that I'm just going to end this portion with is that those two chapters that we dealt with last week, they're actually called an interlude or a pause to the story. Because we get up to those two chapters and it's like the story stops, there's a pause, and then we get these two chapters of interlude to explain the characters and to explain this cosmic battle that we're a part of. It's like we're going along in the story and then we're going to pause our regularly scheduled programming to bring you a bulletin. And the bulletin is all of a sudden the picture zooms out and you get the 50,000 foot look at this cosmic battle that's going on. And we're introduced to these characters that I just explained. And now as we go back into chapters 14, 15, and 16, whoosh, we come right back into it. And the story continues on. But now we're aware that there's a cosmic battle. And now we're aware of the key players that we should be looking for. All right? So that was just a quick recap of last week. So tonight we start out with a big question as we begin chapter 14. And the question is all about who are these 144,000 people that have been sealed or protected, all right? Who are the 144,000? Because that's how this chapter starts, all right? So remember, what did we say about apocalyptic literature? In apocalyptic literature, numbers mean things. And numbers in apocalyptic literature, just like imagery, is very symbolic. All right? So when we think of 144,000, all right? Those of you that are math geniuses and wizards, which I am not, what is the derivative of 144,000? 12 times 12. Oh, so when we say 12s, we know that 12s are significant. We've even talked about it already in our study on Revelation. So 144,000, if you break it down, you can break it down into 12s. 12 groups of 12,000. Not 12 groups of 8,000, not 12 groups of 12. So what is the interpretation? Who are the 144,000 that God is sealing and protecting? Oh, we have 12 tribes in Israel. Yeah. So one of the interpretations here is that the 144,000 refer to Israel, who is sealed for protection by God. Because remember, no matter what has happened with the Jews over the centuries, and today, does anybody know how many Jews are in the world today? 13 million. They're actually up in numbers right now, okay? So during World War II, before World War II, there was 12 million Jews in the world. And then after World War II, they went down to 6 million Jews in the world. So their population was cut in half. And now since then, they're back up to 13 million, 13.5 million, all right? Does anybody know where the largest two concentrations of Jewish population in the world are at? New York City is one. Miami is one, but it's third on the list. Number one is Israel now, because of the number of people that have made Aliyah and have gone back to the land.
So, what's the difference between the religion, Judaism, and the Jewish people? Is that an ethnicity?
Yeah, so Jewishness is an ethnicity, but it's also a religion. But the world doesn't make a distinction between that, all right? Especially the enemy. So if you're a Jew, and this is the point I'm going to make, the majority of Jews in the world today are not what we call observant or religious Jews. They are secular Jews. You say, well, how could that be with their history? Well, the reason it can be is because of their history in many aspects. So after World War II and the Holocaust, right, there were many Jews that were disillusioned with God. How could God allow this to happen? And so many Jews after World War II who were observant pre-World War II became non-observant secular Jews afterwards. So then they have families, and as the population of Jews grows, those children are Jews in culture. They're cultural Jews, they're ethnic Jews, but they're not necessarily following all the Jewish practices. Now, most Jews that you meet, they're going to at least tip their hat or do something around Passover and maybe Rosh Hashanah or the Jewish New Year and Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. They might celebrate or tip their hat to those three things, but they're not celebrating Shabbat on Friday nights. They're not celebrating Sabbath. They're not eating kosher. They're Jews. They're called secular Jews. And so that's the majority of Jews we have in the world today.
Really just 2 tribes, though, that comprise the Jews, those Jews? Because the other 10 tribes were taken away and lost.
Well, the other 10 tribes were dispersed throughout the whole earth. Yeah, and so that has to do with, in 1948, when the Jews start coming from everywhere, the prophecies that God said, I will pull you from every corner of the earth. So what we call the dispersion of the Jews is the diaspora. And so that occurred in 70 AD. The first diaspora occurred in 70 AD when Rome began to really persecute the Jews, and they had to flee Rome, and they went to all different corners of the empire.
Was that the southern kingdom? Northern kingdom had been dispersed.
Yes. The northern kingdom was Israel. They were conquered by the Assyrians and taken into captivity. Then, several hundred years later, the Babylonians came into the southern kingdom, because remember, you have a divided kingdom, northern and southern. Northern kingdom is Israel, southern kingdom is Judah. And then the Babylonians come in, and they wipe out Judah, and they take them in. So they take, in the first wave, they take Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach, they take all the brains, they take all the young people, and then they come back later and take pretty much the rest of the people. Okay, so you have all of that stuff, and then they're dispersed everywhere. Nathan, you have a question.
Yeah, how can it be the Jews, because it says they follow the Lamb wherever he goes? Like, isn't that meaning Christ? How could they be Jewish and converted?
Yes.
Wouldn't that also be Christian, though?
Yes. So I haven't finished yet. So the first interpretation, no, that's good. I'm glad you're on top. I'm glad you're reading and you're looking at it. So the first thing that the Jews could be is 144,000. The second be, it could refer to all who are a part of the body of Christ being sealed by God for protection during this time of the 7 trumpets and the 7 bowls of wrath. Okay? Now again, you say, well, 144,000, there's more than 144,000 Christians and there's more than 144,000 Jews. So what's the answer to that question? I'm not going to answer it. You answer it. We just talked about apocalyptic language. It's a representation. It's symbolic. Okay? So it's not 144,000 people literally. That's where people get confused. So you have the Jehovah's Witnesses that for years and years they preached 144,000 people are going to heaven, and that's us. And then the Jehovah's Witnesses grew beyond 144,000. It wasn't very motivational to the Jehovah's Witnesses. And so now they kind of, oh, that's symbolic now. But they used to believe in a literal 144,000 were going to heaven, right? So the number is symbolic, but the number is significant because it can refer to the 12 tribes of Israel, the Jews. And we know that in the last days, there are going to be many Jewish people. There's going to be an awakening of the Jewish people to their Messiah. All right? So there's going to be those people, but they're also going to be, obviously, us, the people of God. Right? So the number is not literal, but the number is significant for its symbolism. That 144,000, that 12 12s is significant. Because the other thing we have that's 12 that would represent our tribe would be what? The apostles, the 12 apostles. So you have 2 sets of 12 going on there. 12 represented the tribes of Israel. 12 represented the tribes of Christianity, the 12 apostles in a sense. All right? So that's why both things, and so it's probably a both and here. Okay? Because we're going to need some kind of protection. So it's kind of interesting. God is saying, I'm going to protect my people.
So it would be kind of like a shorthand version millions of these people that are before the throne
Mhm.
in more
Yeah.
current vernacular.
They're identifying the groups rather than the number. The who rather than the number.
Who those millions are.
Yeah. Yeah. The number could be anything. The 144,000 tells us the who's, the groups. These are the groups. These are the two collectives of people that God is going to protect in that day. He's going to seal them, right? All right. So then next we move on to kind of this interesting little interlude there in chapter 14, starting in verse 6 with the three angels. All right. There's three angels. And before we get to the bowls of wrath, we're introduced to these three angels, and they're kind of interesting because this interlude is about God encouraging, once again, John's readers, and then therefore us, by showing us the power of the gospel before he shows us the bowls of wrath. It's very interesting how, and I hope you're getting this, and how Revelation is written. God brings encouragement. He shows something that's going to encourage you, that he's on the throne, he's on the Lamb, it's going to be all right, we'll be victorious, before he shows the horrors of what's going to happen. All right? So we saw that in chapter 4 when John, before he knows anything, gets caught up into the throne room, and Jesus is like, hey, let me show you that I'm on the throne. This is all going to be all right, and you're going to be victorious before I start showing you what's going to happen in the end. Right? And so now, in little ways, as we've continued through the book of Revelation, we see that happening again. It's not a whole chapter like chapter 4, but you get these little things where God kind of encourages them before he shows them something bad. And this is what he's doing again here. Only this is kind of, he does it in a backhanded way. And you're going to see as we walk through this. So God's going to show them the power of the gospel through these angels that go out and make these three proclamations, all right? So I want to set this up by saying this. So back in 2010, I remember I went to Africa, and I was teaching at a pastor's conference, and we were doing citywide crusade there. And the place in Africa where we were at was so poor and destitute, it was really hard to stomach. It was really hard to walk around and look at the people. And I remember on that trip, the thing that struck me the most, I mean, it was just right there in your face. So much so that I was convicted in my heart. The thing that struck me the most being with these people was the incredible joy with which they worshiped God. Like they didn't have two sticks literally to rub together. I mean, they were living in cardboard boxes. They were living in anything they could put together to just kind of shelter themselves. It was horrible. And yet, they were so filled with joy. Like you would have thought they'd won $1 million. And we were walking through these shanty towns and we were meeting these people. And I just remember, oh, Lord, I couldn't do this. I would not be joyful if I was living in this place, right? And I realized here were men and women that were just like you and I, but they had nothing, and yet they had everything. Because their joy was so full and their worship was so pure, and you could just feel the presence of God in the midst of that poverty and that just, I don't even know how to describe it. And here's the thought that I want to put in your head. How could that happen? Because the true gospel works everywhere with all people, no matter what their circumstances. See, the good news of the gospel is that the good news works in the deepest, darkest slums of Calcutta, India, and in Indonesia, and in the house churches of China and Iran, where people are being persecuted, and it works in the deepest poverty of Africa, right? Because the gospel, if it's the true gospel, it brings joy, it brings life everywhere it goes. And it's not just for one group of people. It's not just for Americans who have everything. It's not just for one class of people. It's not just for one race or ethnicity of people or one economic status. It's for all things, because the gospel is bigger than all those things. The gospel is good news that transforms people's hearts. That's why something like the prosperity gospel, you don't find that being preached in Africa or, well, I take that back. It is preached in Nigeria, but it causes a lot of problems. But it's not being preached in the slums of Calcutta. It's not being, because it doesn't work there. Their economic problems are not going to be solved by, right? So there are 3.28 billion people around the world that call Jesus Christ Lord right now. In case you weren't aware of that. That's the gospel impacts lives, and that's what we're going to see in Revelation 14, 6 through 7 and going. So 3 angels are sent out. The first angel goes out proclaiming the good news to every tribe and every tongue, encouraging them to come to Christ, because the time has now come that Jesus is going to sit as the judge of the earth. In other words, the angel is proclaiming the rule and the reign of Jesus has come. He's taking over. This is it. This is enough of this nonsense, all right? And so the first angel goes out and proclaims this good news that people should come to Jesus because he's about to set all things right. Now, when we read that, if you're reading that in those 2 verses, you would probably read those 2 verses and there wouldn't be much necessarily that would excite you, all right? You just would kind of read that and go, okay. But if you were living in the early church in 96 AD under Domitian, and you had been watching all of your friends dying around you, and you had been watching for your entire lifetime the Roman Empire winning every battle with no end in sight that they're ever going to lose a battle, this was good news. That Jesus was about to move into action. So the first angel goes out to proclaim that Jesus is about ready to set up shop. So it's a call to the earth to come and to give their lives to him. And we know the end of the story in John's day. All right? The gospel eventually did win the battle against the Roman Empire and against all of its emperors. And Christianity in 300 AD becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire. Rome would fall, just like was predicted in Daniel's vision of the statue. Rome would fall, but guess what? The gospel continued on. The church flourished. The church was victorious, right? And so what this passage is encouraging us is to keep, as believers, and in their day, specifically to them, this passage was meant to encourage them to keep proclaiming the good news locally and globally. All right? So for us, wherever we can, we need to keep, no matter what's happening in our world, no matter what's happening in the Middle East, no matter what's happening in the United States, Canada, who cares? Keep proclaiming the good news wherever we can, because Jesus is on the move. All right? So the first angel's proclamation of the gospel is pretty straightforward. We understand that. But then a second angel appears and begins to make another proclamation about the gospel, but this time the approach is different. This angel begins to proclaim Babylon is fallen. Wickedness has been defeated. Now, what was Babylon code for? Anybody know? Rome. All right? So in this sense, the proclaiming of the gospel is stepping into people's lives who have been wrecked by horrible government, by sin, and waking them up to the condition, okay, that there is another way. Babylon has fallen. Everything you put your trust in, it's all falling. It's all going to fall apart, all right? In this sense, it's already falling apart because we're already well into Revelation, right? But there is an alternative, and his name is Jesus. So these people are watching everything in their world, everything that they've known, everything they've trusted, everything they believed in, disintegrating before their eyes. And this angel comes at it from another angle. Babylon is fallen. Evil and wickedness is being defeated, right? These people are watching institutions and governments fall that they never thought would ever fall. Look there's coming a time in our world where all the governments of the world are going to fall, and it's going to lead to a one world ruler, right? And so the people, as they're watching this scenario, everything around them falling, and we're starting to see the beginnings of that now. This is why there's such a move amongst Gen Z young men toward Christianity right now, is because they're watching all the stuff that their parents grew up with. It's all falling apart. They're finding it's all meaningless. It's all empty, right? And so they want something different. So the people are overcome with fear, so they need to hear good news. Yes, Babylon is fallen. Wickedness is falling. But there is an alternative, and his name is Jesus. Now, what's kind of interesting is the idea of Babylon falling that we read about here is on a corporate level. It's talking about the institutions, the governments of the world, the philosophies of the world. They're all falling apart, and people are losing their minds because they put their trust in that. So the good news is, we got another place for you to put your trust in, all right? But the idea of Babylon falling can also be seen on an individual level in the story of the prodigal son in Luke 15. Because think about it. Here's a kid who's riding high and mighty with the inheritance that he's received from his father 1 minute, and then it all falls apart, and he finds himself in the pig pen the next minute. All right? So for him, Babylon, it's interesting. It tells us that when the son received his inheritance, he went to the far country, or the Decapolis. And the far country of the Decapolis was like, basically, it was the Las Vegas of the day. It was the place where people went to sin and to carouse and to do all these things. And so he goes off to Babylon, in a sense, and he blows it all, and he ends up in the pig pen. And here's what's interesting. At that point, the prodigal son decides to what? To go home, to return to his father. So what we're seeing in this second proclamation is the angel is saying, Babylon is fallen. Everything you know is falling apart. He's trying to wake people up to the same epiphany that the prodigal son had, that it's time to return to the Father. You've had your fill of Babylon. You see that it doesn't satisfy, that it leaves you empty. Return to the Father. And so the world and the people in it who have been broken by sin are now hearing that the gospel is there to save them if they will embrace it. Right? So this is a second presentation or proclamation of the gospel. It's a little bit different. Now, the third one is the one that's kind of hard to stomach. The third angel. Because this passage, and I want to read it to you, is a lot more challenging, but there's some interesting little nuggets in here. And so in verses 9 through 11, the angel begins to declare the devastation that's going to come on those who sin and rebel against God in this world. All right? So the angel in these verses is showing the consequences that sin brings into people's lives and that sin brings into the world. And it is a frightening picture. Because here's what it says. Then a third angel followed them, shouting, anyone who worships the beast and his statue, or accepts his mark on the forehead or on the hand, must drink the wine of God's anger. It has been poured full strength into God's cup of wrath. And they will be tormented with fire and burning sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment will rise forever and ever, and they will have no relief day or night, for they have worshipped the beast and his statue, and they have accepted the mark of his name. Now, this passage is showing us what happens to those who compromise with the culture and align themselves with the beast. Again, notice the stuff with the mark of the beast, the head and the hand, okay? It's this imagery again. It's this imagery of allegiance. So these people have given their allegiance to the beast. And this third angel comes and says, hey, look it. I want to tell you what's going to happen to all of you who give your allegiance to the beast. Here is what your end is going to be. And then he basically paints a picture of hell. right? And so you say, well, where's the good news in that? That's the tough part about this third angel's proclamation. But there is good news in it, all right? It's important in these days, first of all, what we learn from this for the church, for us, is that we should never and can never shrink from calling sin, sin, and evil, evil, right? Because what the third angel is getting at is there's all these people that have aligned themselves. And remember, we talked about there will be a great falling away of the church. The false prophet will deceive many Christians. We talked about it last week. Many Christian denominations right now are forsaking what it says in the Bible and instead embracing cultural norms that are not biblical, right? That's all the work of the false prophet. The false prophet is a deceiver. He's trying to get you to come over to the cultural side, to forsake God, you know? And so all of these people, this is going to be their end, who have given their allegiance to the beast. And because people's lives are on the line, we proclaim the gospel when we stand against sin and evil and we draw the line. And we make it very clear to people that you're either on this side of the line or this side of the line. And if you're on this side of the line, this is what you can expect in the end. So this is a third presentation of the gospel, but this would be like your hardcore, these are the consequences of not serving Jesus. Like that third angel just comes right and say, you're gonna be in torment, you're gonna burn, it's an awful picture, right? It's the fire and brimstone approach. So the gospel is good news, but it's only good news if you're willing to forsake your allegiance to sin and the beast. And that's what this third angel is proclaiming. So what's interesting about this is that in this passage, we see three different aspects of the gospel being presented by these three angels, okay? Now, if you go to Revelation chapter 16, verses 13 through 16, I want to point out something interesting. I'm going to read this, and then we're going to talk about it. It says, and I saw, so what did we just talk about? Three angels? Now you jump over 2 chapters, and in 16:13 it says, and I saw 3 evil spirits that looked like frogs leap from the mouths of the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet. They are demonic spirits who, get this, work miracles. What's that about? Deception. And go out to all the rulers of the world to gather them for battle against the Lord on that great judgment day of God the Almighty. In the Old Testament, the great judgment day is also referred to as, over and over again, the day of the Lord. Okay? And in verse 15 it says, look, I will come as unexpectedly as a thief. So blessed are all who are watching for me, who keep their clothing ready so they will not have to walk around naked and ashamed. And the demonic spirits gathered all the rulers and all their armies to a place with the Hebrew name Armageddon. All right. Remember how I told you before? Satan counterfeits everything that God does. Right? What do we see here? What is he counterfeiting? The 3 angels. So there are 3 demonic spirits that usher out of the mouth of the dragon, the false prophet, and the beast. And they're doing the same thing that God's angels were doing. So the 3 angels go out to proclaim the good news in different ways. What do the 3 evil spirits do? They go out to proclaim the philosophies of the dragon. They're out recruiting, exactly. And why does it talk about miracles in there? Because they're mimicking God. They're deceiving people by doing miracles so that it looks like they're legit. That's why we as Christians have to be discerning. We have to have discernment, right? And what's interesting is they're not only deceiving people into their way, but at the end of the day, they deceive the nations of the world to gather together on the plains of Armageddon to attack who? God's people, the Jews. All right? So I am thrilled that the hostages were released on Monday. And it would be awesome if we can move through the process and get peace for a number of years. But just understand, whatever peace that we get is going to be temporary, because lasting peace will only come when Jesus' feet hit the Mount of Olives and he defeats these armies, the nations of the world, that are going to gather one last time to try and wipe out Israel, who has never been wiped out and cannot be wiped out, because God's not going to allow it, because God will always have a remnant, no matter how small they are. So the three angels proclaim the good news. The three evil spirits proclaim lies that bring the nations to Armageddon. Now, one more little point I want to make here. Notice where the scripture about the unexpected coming of Jesus is placed in this timeline. Yeah, right before Armageddon starts. All right, remember we were talking about a couple weeks ago the whole scenario of when the rapture and how the rapture occurs, and the whole cultural thing of the people ran out to meet the king and then came back into the city with him. It was all one thing, right? Again, just my opinion, but to me it's very interesting that all the armies are gathering, and then I will come unexpectedly as a thief. Now, we think of the coming unexpectedly to catch us away. But in context here, who are the ones that are going to be surprised? The gathering armies of the world. The rulers of the world, the Antichrist, are going to be surprised when all of a sudden, boom, just about the time they are finally going to rid the world of Israel and the Jews, unexpectedly Jesus shows up. And he speaks the word out of his mouth, and the armies of the world are leveled. And he snatches their victory away, and it turns into a massive, unexpected defeat. Right? And then it's kind of interesting. Blessed are all who are watching for me, who keep their clothing ready, so you won't have to walk around naked and ashamed. That's interesting language, too, about that harkens back to the parable of the 10 virgins and keeping oil in our lamps, making sure that we're ready, right? Making sure that we maintain our faith even in like those difficult times. So I just wanted to point that out to you, because it's just kind of interesting timing when we talk about Jesus coming back and the thief, and then you cross-reference that with Thessalonians. That's interesting there where he has that. Why would he drop that in there? Because it's not unexpected, like just for Christians. Oh, all of a sudden Jesus appeared. It's going to be unexpected for the armies who think they finally have won. Satan has finally won, and then boom, Jesus appears. All right? Then finally, in Revelation 14, verses 12 and 13, here's the other thing that goes along with that. It says that God's people must endure persecution, and that many will die in the Lord. See, that's the thing that we as Christians don't want to hear. Hey, I thought we were into a pre-trib rapture, like we are out of here, baby. We're going to be in heaven, sitting down at the marriage supper of the Lamb. We're going to be eating chicken wings and whatever your favorite thing is, and we're going to be having a party. Well, all this mess is going down there. But remember, we've talked about, well, who's going to be proclaiming the gospel during that time so that people can be saved? Right? And then all of a sudden, there's this interesting timing of where it says he comes back as unexpectedly as a thief in the night. And then he follows that up by saying to the people in John's day, hey, by the way, my people are going to have to endure persecution, not wrath. Okay, what we're going to see next, the bowls of wrath, what we saw in the seven trumpets, that's reserved for the wicked. God is protecting us from that. But he said, you are going to have to go through persecution, and many of you will die. So again, study the scriptures for yourself. All right? But look at these things. What is I'm just pointing out to you what it said in the Word. I'm just saying, oh, that's interesting. Because we're not hearing from many pulpits today, hey, by the way, I need to tell all of you that are here today on this beautiful Sunday morning, you better get ready for persecution, and there are many of you that are going to die. Well, it's not being preached in America, but it is being preached in China, and it is being preached in Iran, and it is being preached in Indonesia, and it is being preached in Thailand, it is being preached in Myanmar and other places of the world. Because that's their reality. Remember, I told you, I made the statement, if you ask them about the tribulation, they say, we are in the tribulation. Every day our life is a tribulation. We're running for our lives. Okay? So just some interesting stuff there for you to think about. All right. At this point now, the passage, the scene turns, and we see two harvests. And this is interesting. Chapter 14, verses 14 through 16, the first harvest is found. And it's Jesus through the church by the Spirit harvesting believers from the earth, from every tribe, tongue, and nation. And we see this refrain repeated. The earth is the Lord's and everyone in it. Okay? Which is interesting. And then, right on the heels of that, we see a second harvest that's enacted by an angel that comes out from the throne room of God with a sickle in his hand. And then we read in verses 17 through 20 some really bloody, nasty stuff. So let me read it to you. After that, after what? After the first harvest, the harvest of God's people. Another angel came from the temple in heaven who had a sharp sickle. And then another angel who had power to destroy with fire came from the altar. And he shouted to the angel with a sharp sickle, swing your sickle now to gather the clusters of grapes from the vines of the earth, for they are ripe for judgment. So the angel swung his sickle over the earth and loaded the grapes into the great winepress of God's wrath. And the grapes were trampled in the winepress outside the city, and blood flowed from the winepress in a stream about 180 miles long and as high as a horse's bridle. What is this the picture of? This is the picture of God harvesting the wicked of the earth. And this harvest is symbolic of the total destruction of God's enemies who are gathered and then cast into the winepress of his wrath. Right? Again, put yourself in the position to understand this of a first century believer. Domitian is a monster, right? Remember, what did we say the Christians' nickname for Domitian was in that day? The beast. All right? So when John talks about the beast out of the sea, they know who that is. That political ruler, that Domitian for their time. All right? And so they're suffering and they're struggling, and then they read this, that there's going to be a harvest. You're going to be saying, but this harvest, that one day God is going to just totally destroy all the evil and all the wickedness. And again, these prophecies are called double reference prophecies. In other words, they saw them as applying to their day, and they also apply to the end of days. Okay? And so the imagery of a wine press which crushes grapes is being used to depict the immense scale of God's judgment, where rivers of blood, if you can imagine this, rivers of blood will flow, signifying the complete annihilation of those who oppose God. So it confirms right here that judgment will ultimately come to those who have opposed God. So the message of the third angel, if you continue in your rebellious ways, these are the consequences. Now we begin to see the consequences being poured out in the second harvest, okay? Now, I want to stop for a moment because, again, Revelation is apocalyptic literature. I can't emphasize that enough. You interpret apocalyptic literature different than you do narrative or poetry or the Gospels or anything else, right? So there is this fascinating but horrifying image where we are told that this crushing will produce an amount of blood that stretches 180 miles long and as high as a horse's bridle. So does anybody know the average height of a horse's bridle? And just an average horse. I had to look it up. So an average horse would be 15 hands, and 15 hands is equal to 5 feet. So that's a river of blood that's 180 miles long and 5 foot deep. That's a lot of blood. So let me put it in perspective. That's roughly the length of Israel right now, from top to bottom. Because if you didn't know, Israel's not a really big place. It's like a postage stamp. First time I went to Israel, we went from top to bottom in a day, and I was like, what? And you can go from side to side in like 45 minutes. So it's like, because their roads aren't like our roads, it's like 3.5, 4 hours top to bottom, go from the Dead Sea up to Galilee or whatever, and then 45 minutes to an hour side to side. Okay, so it's not a very big place. So basically, you're talking about all of Israel, which that imagery makes sense if all the armies are gathered at Armageddon and the blood flows and God defeats them all, right? But remember, Revelation is apocalyptic literature. It's exaggerated to make a point. So when it talks about blood that is 180 miles long and 5 feet deep, does that necessarily have to be literal? What is the point of making that statement? The point is, this gruesome, bloody imagery speaks of the total and complete defeat of all of God's armies anywhere. Now, could it be literal? It could be, but because it's apocalyptic literature, it's probably not. That's like saying, with your favorite sports team, our team murdered them the other night. There was limbs everywhere. Well, did they murder them? No. Were there limbs everywhere? But we get the point. They killed them. They just slaughtered them. Right? Again, I think that's kind of the point being taken, because people read that and go, oh my gosh, right? And it is going to be bad. Because Israel's enemies are going to be, and God's enemies are going to be completely annihilated. But the language, again, remember, apocalyptic language is meant to evoke a gut response. It's designed to make you feel something, all right? And when you read that, you feel something, you feel sick. Because once you figure out it's 180 miles long by 5 foot deep, you're like, ugh, right? That's pretty gross, right? But now let's flip it. Again, in all of this, God is encouraging his people to proclaim the gospel. Why? So that men and women will come to know him, believe in him, and be spared from this. So the interesting thing about Revelation, we talked about in week 1, is that Revelation is a book of encouragement, and it's also a book of discipleship. God is teaching his people in the end days how they are to live and how they are to respond and what their mission is. And the mission is proclaiming the gospel. So isn't it interesting that throughout Revelation, we see over and over again the message coming through. Keep proclaiming the gospel. Hey, people are going to die. This is going to happen. So you better tell people. You better warn people, right? As opposed to what I talked about in week 1 has happened over the last 60 years in the church or more, where the eschatological scheme that we bought into has caused the church to enter into escapism. Right? It hasn't caused us to be more evangelistic. It's caused us to be less evangelistic in many respects. Right? Revelation is not only designed to say we win, it was designed to motivate the people of John's day and all of us. Get out there and tell people. You got a job to do. You and I, we're partnering together so that as many people can be saved as possible. Right? And so this section is about encouraging us to keep proclaiming the gospel and everything. And then with that, we move into Revelation chapter 15, verse 5 through chapter 16, the rest of 16, which is all about this thing called the bowls of wrath. Now, the bowls of wrath are very difficult to read. They're very painful to read because it's horrible stuff that's going to be poured out on the earth. This is wrath, which is different than persecution, all right? But I want to point out something, and we have seen this already. So there is a literary device being used in the rest of chapter 15 and verse 16 called recapitulation. All right? I'll put it on the board here. right? So that's the word. This is the literary device, recapitulation. Does anybody know what this means in literature? It's the first thing you said, saying over and over again in a different way. So recapitulation is a literary thing where you say the same thing. You tell the same story, but you tell it from a different angle, all right? You tell it from a different vantage point, all right? Same story, but told from different angles. So does anybody know where else we see recapitulation happen in the New Testament? The Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all right? Those are called the Synoptic Gospels because they all basically tell the same stories, but they tell them a little bit different because they're told from the angle of their readers. Matthew is speaking to Jews, so he tells the story differently than Mark, who's speaking to Gentiles, and different from Luke, they all have a different audience. So they all are telling the story from their viewpoint, which is a little different. So you get different angles on the stories, and sometimes that's where people come up with, there are contradictions in the Bible. They're not contradictions. One is leaving something out because it's not important to his readers, where the other person wants his readers to know this particular fact, right? So the same story is being told from different. There was actually a movie. I don't know if any of you remember this. It was a number of years ago. It was a movie called Vantage Point. It was a political thriller with Dennis Quaid, where there was an attempt on the president's life, and they tell the story again and again throughout the movie from different vantage points from multiple people that witnessed the event because they're trying to piece together who did it. And so it's called Vantage Point. That's what's going on here. So if you remember, we said that the 7 seals with the 4 horsemen were how the church was going to experience the end times, which is the time between Jesus' ascension and his second coming. All of that is considered by the Apostle Paul the end times. All right? So just a little bit of refresh. A lot of people say, boy, the end times are coming. No, the end times are already here. We've been living in the end times or the church age, okay? So, and the trumpets, we said, were how those who are non-believers will experience things, that same amount of time. And we talked about all the different things that happen. So here's what I want to show you. The bowls of wrath line up almost identically to the trumpets. Recapitulation. So now what we're going to see in the rest of chapter 15 and 16 is the same things we've already seen, but it's coming from a different angle, a different vantage point. Okay? The bowls and the trumpets are the same. So the first trumpet affects the earth, and so does the first bowl. The second trumpet affects the sea, and so does the second bowl. The third trumpet affects rivers, and the third bowl affects rivers. The fourth trumpet affects the sun. The fourth bowl affects the sun. The fifth trumpet is about the pit of evil. The fifth bowl is about the pit of evil. The sixth trumpet affects the mighty Euphrates River, and so does the sixth bowl. All right? So they match. It's what we're seeing in the bowls of wrath being poured out is the same thing we've already seen in the trumpets from the perspective now. Here's the perspective change. This time when we're viewing this, it's coming from the perspective of the holiness of God on his throne. We're getting another vantage point of the same event. So in Revelation 15:5 it says, "Then I looked and I saw that the temple in heaven, God's tabernacle, was thrown wide open." Now what's interesting about that phrase, God's tabernacle, it's translated with different phrases in other versions, but it's all the same. The phrase God's tabernacle is found in Numbers chapter 1 verses 50 and 53. It's the place where the 10 Commandments were kept, in the tabernacle. So the bowls of wrath, here the perspective is, why is God doing that? We talked in other weeks about his justice, that the wrath of God simply allows the consequences of sin. God isn't sitting up there, how can I whip up some wrath for these people? But we talked about wrath is born out of tremendous love. We had those discussions. And so we talked about people experience the wrath of God because they've rejected God. It's not that he's making it personal. It's the consequences of not living for him. So here the point is, again, the bowls of wrath come out of the moral law, which is the 10 Commandments and the presence of God. All of heaven is watching the bowls of wrath poured out on those who have rebelled against God's moral law, right? In other words, they've come out against God's holiness, and therefore now they're experiencing the wrath. So what's interesting here is, again, we want to get our perspective right. God gave the law to mankind so that humans could flourish, right? Because the law, the 10 Commandments, were the basic requirements to having a civilized society. Could you just stop killing each other? Could you just stop lying to each other? Could you just stop sleeping around with each other's wives, okay? It's the basic minimum. That's why I say to people, when someone says to me, you know, why are you going to heaven? Well, because I keep the 10 Commandments. Oh, do you want a gold star for that? So what you're telling me is you should get into heaven just because you don't kill anybody. Just because you haven't slept with anybody else's wife. Just because you have... Because in God's eyes, the 10 Commandments are like the training wheels. It's like the lowest level for a civilized society. That's why in the New Testament, you see Jesus take those and ramp them up. And now it becomes a matter of the heart. You know, it's not just about murdering your brother. If you think about it, you did it. Because what Jesus was getting at was the issues of the heart. If you obsess about something, if you think about something long enough, it turns into action. So he says, don't even think about killing your brother. Don't even think about another woman, right? All those things. So God gave the law, basic right. So God has ordered the cosmos so that men and women could flourish, and so that his order and beauty might be seen in worship. Now, here's that word that I preached on a couple of months ago again, order. God in Genesis brings order out of chaos. Why? So that mankind can flourish and experience the beauty and the wonder of the earth. But what's happening with the bowls now is that people have turned their back on God, accused God of bad things happening in their lives because they see everything devolving back into chaos. Why? Because we talked about this a couple weeks ago. They've rejected God, so God says, okay, have your way. And as soon as God lifts his hands from the earth, everything starts going to chaos. So that's why in the seals and then in the bowls, you see all of these natural calamities start to happen. Because if God's not keeping his hand on making things run properly, and he says, okay, you're on your own, bad things start happening and people start blaming God. So you see in Revelation 16:9, it says, everyone was burned by this blast of heat, and they cursed the name of God who had control over all these plagues. They did not repent of their sins and turn to God and give him glory. And then in verse 11 it says, and they cursed the God of heaven for their pains and sores, but they did not repent of their evil deeds and turn to God. And then in verse 21 it says, there was terrible hailstorm, and hailstones weighing as much as 75 pounds fell from the sky onto the earth below. And they cursed God because of the terrible plagues of the hailstorm. Instead of repenting and turning to God, to Jesus, who defeats the dragon, kills the beast, brings light and life and order so that mankind can flourish, they double down and they curse God for everything that's happening. When Jesus said, I have come to give you life and life more abundantly. So the point here is mankind has rebelled and rejected Jesus and said, we don't want you. We'd rather follow the dragon. So here's what's interesting. The bowls of wrath were designed for the dragon and the beasts and the demons, not mankind. Just like hell was created for the devil and his angels, for the beast, for the Antichrist, not for mankind. Same thing with these, the wrath, the bowls, the seals. They were created for them, not for mankind. But when people join with the dragon and the beast, they become collateral damage in this cosmic war. They experience the same wrath and the fate as the dragon and the beast, but it was never intended for mankind. So let me end with this. What we see happen in verse 17 then of chapter 16 is the best news in the book of Revelation until we get to the final chapter when all things are made new. The good news is in verse 17, the wrath of God has an end date. In other words, God is love and he has wrath, but his wrath won't last forever. So in verse 17 it says, then the seventh angel poured out his bowl into the air, and a mighty shout came from the throne in the temple saying, it is finished. So God ends it. I want to just encourage you with this as we close tonight. The gospel is an unstoppable force, and when we join with the three angels in proclaiming the good news, we are joining with God's plan to redeem the people of the earth. God has placed you on the earth at this particular time in history for such a time as this, so that you and I can partner with the host of heaven, with the Holy Spirit, in bringing about a great end-time harvest of souls. Never forget that. So even in the midst of their suffering, even in the midst of all that was going on in the Roman Empire, the early church, the believers of the early church, they kept proclaiming the gospel. They did not let persecution stop them. They did not let people say to them, this thing and that thing, and scare them away from speaking the truth about Domitian and about other rulers. They didn't. They kept going. And if it cost them their life, it cost them their life. They were bold. They stood up. They kept proclaiming the gospel. And the ultimate result was that Rome was defeated. And the gospel won. That's the message of Revelation. What we take away from this book is the encouragement that, there's a lot of bad things that are going to happen. But Jesus is on the throne. We have the victory. We can't stop. We are called to partner with him to reach people so they don't have to experience the seven seals, the seven bowls, so that they can be saved. That's our mission. That's why we're here, right? And we do it to the very end until Jesus shows up. Okay? And so Revelation, again, it should encourage us to stick with the battle. You're going to win. It should motivate us to say, man, I got to tell people. People need to know the truth. And you're going to get people that receive the truth and are so glad you told them. You're going to get people that basically spit in your face and say, you're a lunatic. The early Christians didn't care. It was only important that they proclaimed the good news. And if people embraced it, wonderful. And if they didn't, they just kept moving. Right? And that's what we have to do. All right. Fantastic. Well, have a good evening. Safe travels home.